because Putin specifically rules through the intelligence services, which is a combination of rule of terror and rule of infiltration, it's probably pretty stable. It's just that it's pretty brittle. So the Russian government, Putin specifically, is not vulnerable until the day that they are. Looking back along the stretch of history, if you look at the year before every coup or revolution, there was no reason to think anything was wrong. It all boils up very quickly, but you have to have a mass trigger. So, for example, the loss in the Crimea War damaged the czars. The loss in the October Revolution triggered the withdrawal from World War I and the collapse of the czarist system. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to the fall of Khrushchev. You have to have that very short, sharp, painful realization that Russia has lost and lost big, and then the underlying population that has been buying into the propaganda realize it's all wrong, and then the government turns. We're not there yet. I don't think the fall of Crimea even would be enough to do that. But that is really the only thing that's on the short-term horizon that would even maybe fall into that category.
So it would have to be something bigger than that even.
Yes. You'd have to have a mass defeat. So, for example, if the Ukrainians were able to not simply cut that rail line, those rail lines going into Crimea, but actually advance to the coast, so that Crimea becomes basically a death camp run by Russians where Russians are dying and starving. Because remember, the Russians destroyed the Kharkiv Dam. There's no more irrigation for agriculture in Crimea at all. So all the food is imported. If you turn that into a very public, globally aware place where the Russians are dying in the streets because they can't get food in, maybe.
If we could just talk a little bit about the state of Russian forces at the moment. Figures obtained by the BBC and an independent Russian media outlet, Media Zone, has said that more Russian fighters had died in the 10-month battle for Bakhmut than in the 10-year Afghan war. And the Ministry of Defence here in the UK has put the total number of Russian casualties since the start of the full-scale invasion at more than 500,000. How is Russia meeting those challenges of replacing its personnel?
I can't comment about Avdiivka or Bakhmut. Those numbers are just too squirrely. I don't want to say that they're wrong. I think they're in the right realm. As for the 500,000 number, I think that's absolutely accurate. Keep in mind, the Russians have 8 million men in their 20s, or at least that's what they started the war with. If they've lost 500,000 now, and 1 million have fled, that still leaves them with 6.5 million bodies to throw at this problem. And to be perfectly blunt, the Russians have yet to fully mobilize. Most of the people that they've brought in through their draft system have been minorities from ethnically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged areas. They haven't really gotten into the core of what the country is capable of. That's still ahead of us. But at this rate, there's no way the Russians can keep this up for another 8 years. And I know that sounds like a long time. It is. But remember two things. Number one, the Russians never fight short wars. They do short intimidations. Their wars are always long because they're always about human waves. Number two, if they do this, this is their last war, because there aren't enough Russians under age 20 to theoretically repopulate the system. So when this is done one way or another, Russia is done. If the Ukrainians can achieve, even just for brief moments, local air superiority, then the capacities of the capacities of the Ukrainian military to launch offensives changes. Every offensive that the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority. And if they can't maneuver functionally with armor and armored vehicles, then they can't move nearly as quickly. They can't move in large number, and it makes it a lot easier for Russian artillery to pick them apart. Well, if you can achieve, even just for a few hours, a certain blanket, then the tables turn and the Ukrainians can do things like clear mines without having to get shot at from artillery. And you throw a Patriot into that, you throw the new F-16s into that, you combine that with a little bit more liberal restrictions on the Ukrainians' ability to target objects within Russia proper, and you're seeing the Ukrainians already starting to use things like the ATACMS to prep, say, Crimea, by basically taking out something like an S-400 air defense system a day for the last week. and the Russians only have 50 of those for their entire country. So we're changing the shape of the battlefield very quickly. You plug a Patriot into that process, and we can actually have perhaps a meaningful counteroffensive this summer.
Interesting that you mentioned those strikes on Russian air defences in occupied Crimea this week, hitting surface-to-air missile systems. It does look like the Ukrainians are exploiting a new weakness here, doesn't it?
Well, the S-400s have always been a bit of a mystery from the American and the NATO point of view, because until you're in a hot war, you have no idea how well the top of the line equipment is going to work. Well, the S-400 is supposedly, pre-war, the most sophisticated anti-missile and anti-aircraft weapon system on the planet, much better supposedly than what the Americans could do. And now we discover it can't deal with rockets. So not only is this taking the Russians down several pegs in terms of their own feeling of their invulnerability, not only is it reducing the interest of countries like India in getting any weapon systems from the Russians, because now they realize they're not all that, it's changing the complexion of what is possible. Because if you can basically in one spot bleed the entire Russian air defense grid, then you're not just talking about a change in the Ukraine war, you're talking about a change in what Russia is capable of. And we're still kind of coming to grips with what that means. This is also new.
So, in that light, could it be just literally a matter of time until Ukraine can shut down Russia in Crimea, cut it off, and stop Russia's ability to support the war from there?
That is definitely the goal. Even if you don't conquer, reconquer, liberate, whatever word you want to use, Crimea, its military supply basically goes on two routes. There's a rail route that is on the mainland that goes through Mariupol, which is somewhat vulnerable to Ukrainian assault today. And that's the new line. That's the backup line. And then you've got the primary line, which is the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is becoming increasingly vulnerable. And I would argue that if the Ukrainians wanted to take that out today, they could, but they're waiting for more military capacity. And when you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass. And that's a different sort of complex. So this summer is going to get really interesting. Will the Ukrainians be able to pull this off? Don't know. Everyone like me who saw this war coming, we all made predictions about how this was going to go, and we were all wrong. And then we got new data and we reassessed, and we were all wrong again. I'm just trying to highlight where we're seeing things move and where that might take us.
Yeah, you say this summer could get very interesting. The winter could be quite desperate because President Zelensky has stressed the need for more air defences at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. They've been looking at trying to build up resilience in the energy infrastructure. And really, I mean, he's right, isn't it? Because you can't really talk about resilience before you have the fundamentals in place to protect those systems.
The winter is going to be awful. It doesn't matter really what happens at this point. It's just a question of how much worse does it get. The Russians have basically taken something called the Fab 1500, dusted it off from their Cold War storage, put a Chinese-made flight kit on it, and have glide bombed it in and simply destroyed entire power plants. The Fab 1500 has roughly a metric ton of explosives in it, and it has a blast radius in excess of 3/4 of a kilometer. So you're not talking about sending an Iranian drone into a small transformer station, something that can be repaired in a few hours. You're talking about leaving a crater in the ground where a power generation asset used to be. And that's basically the entirety of southern and eastern Ukraine now. So there simply is not enough power. The only way that communities that are kind of east of Kiev and southeast of Kiev are going to have electricity this summer is if it's imported from the European Union. So it's a question now of transmission. Now, luckily, transmission is cheaper to put up than new generation. But yes, it's going to be a cold winter for all concerned.
A lot of the European leaders appear to be petrified by the nuclear issue, particularly those countries who don't have nuclear weapons themselves. And I think it is complete bluff and bluster. Putin was saying they're defenseless, saying he's going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I've said this often and written about it often, that this is just not going to happen. And I think really importantly, what we've seen with Ukraine being given the ability to use sophisticated American and British missiles to strike into Russia has made that completely unworkable, because Russia's tactical nuclear weapons are on what's called Iskander missiles, and these are on big trucks, and they're also put on aircraft like Su-57s. Now, those missiles need to only have a range of 400 kilometers. They need to be on the Ukraine border to fire them. Now, with all the intelligence that we're hoovering up, I expect the Ukrainians would have at least several hours, if not a day or so, of information of this. So they now have the ability to take out the Russian nuclear launchers themselves, and the same with the aircraft. So I think it is a complete irrelevance, and Putin knows that, and I think that's why he was so verbose and demonstrative at the weekend on this particular issue, because I think he sort of feels that things are running through his hands. He's losing his grip, but maybe if he can get some of the softer members of Parliament in Europe to keep worrying about it, then that's a chance. But I think it's very important that people, not only in this country but across Europe, understand, in my opinion, and I've been looking at this a heck of a lot over the years, I think the Russian tactical nuclear deterrent is completely unusable.
And do you think it's significant, therefore, that comments from the Kremlin, from Vladimir Putin himself, around this issue have come about in a time when we've seen the US say to Ukraine, okay, we're going to give you the green light to use in a limited capacity some of our weaponry to strike targets inside Russia, and that the comments from the Kremlin have sort of arisen out of that context?
I think absolutely, because if Putin can convince European NATO leaders that this is going to lead to escalation, then then that's for him good, because he knows that that's the last thing people want. But actually, he's done nothing. So we know for the last 4 weeks and over the last few days, Ukraine has been using Russian British missiles to take out targets in Russia. What has happened? Putin has, more hot air is coming out of the Kremlin and him in St. Petersburg, but nothing actually is happening. And it's been the same for the last, since the 24th of February 2022, when he and some of his other lapdogs have been shouting the nuclear issue. Nothing has happened. There has been no escalation in over 2 years. So again, I just hope that Western leaders and our own politicians realize this and make decisions on the basis that I've said is his nuclear capability is unusable, rather than assume that it is. Assume that it isn't, and we'll be in a much better place, because, as I've said, I think the front lines are in the balance at the moment, but the balance is shifting very much towards Ukraine with ability to strike into Russia. And again, with warfare, we've talked about morale. Once you start to get a bit of momentum, then things are huge. And the other issue that is significant is what we call the air war. So the sea war, Ukraine has won. The Black Sea Fleet has disappeared, so Ukraine has freedom of maneuver in the sea. On the ground, they need air power to have freedom of maneuver on the ground. If they get freedom of maneuver, the Ukrainians, that is, they can punch through those defenses. And apart from these missiles and the ability to strike into Russia, we know the F-16s are coming over the horizon. If Ukraine can dominate the air and get air superiority, even air parity, then they can start moving on the ground. So I think that's why I think this is also pivotal. This summer is key, because we know with grand strategic things like potentially Trump coming into power, then that could change the American attitude. So in one way, I think Putin is trying to hold on until November, because he thinks Trump will be a bonus for him. But for the Ukrainians, and I think for NATO and ourselves, we've got to absolutely push as hard as we can. And now there is a glimmer of hope, reinforce success, get on with it. So yeah, absolutely key, the way things are moving. And I think Putin's rant at the weekend in St. Petersburg is somebody who's really worried. I think he realizes that, things are going south. They're not going his way, and there could be a chance that he could be back where he started in 2014, and that would be the end of him. The 1,000-mile front line has been fairly static, although the Russians have been making some significant gains. And really for the last year or perhaps 2 years, Ukraine has almost been fighting with one hand behind its back, because it hasn't had the ability to actually, or permission is probably the wrong word, to strike into Russia itself. That has been discouraged by the Allies. And until really a few days ago, the US has not allowed its precision-guided weaponry to be used to do that. Now that all NATO countries who are supporting Ukraine have really given the go-ahead, it is potentially going to tip the balance. And some of the attacks over the last few days are absolutely saying that. Now, the attack on the stealth, the most modern, sophisticated Russian fighter, the Su-57, that is in the media at the moment, is, on the face of it, lose one fighter, sort of so what? But from a morale perspective, for the Ukrainians, it's fantastic. And for the Russians, it's a severe blow. This is the fighter that fires the hypersonic missiles that are doing so much damage. It's supposed to be completely immune to anything, but actually, a drone has taken it out. Now, I think what else is important, and it's an open secret, that the Ukrainians are getting an awful lot of intelligence for this targeting from NATO, from predominantly, I expect, the US and the UK. So that is having a huge impact. We're also hearing about an attack on a command and control, command and control node, which again, actually, it's from a military perspective, if you cut off the communications, cut off the direction, we know that the Russian troops on the front line are all very poorly trained, desperate morale. And if they're getting no orders and being told what to do, then that is a rabble. And that's what Ukraine wants. They want this Russian force to turn into a rabble. So in order to do that and attack, up to 400 kilometers into Russia, I think that swung the balance. And let's face it, Russia has not been hamstrung by this. They can attack from anywhere. So, yeah, I think this might be that we might be on the top of the tide, as it were, and it could be significant. And the fact that Putin over the weekend has been screaming about nuclear attack yet again, saying that Europe is defenseless, to me is really showing how concerned that he is getting hit, that actually, and we also heard him talking about ceasefires and peace talks sort of 10 days ago, that actually the special military operation might be about to crumble.
Well, we can go into a number of the things you mentioned in more detail over our conversation, but you mentioned there that the attack on the command node, the Russian command node, that was directly hit by Ukraine. You talked about morale based on your experience on the ground serving in the armed forces. If you were a commander or indeed a soldier and you have one of your command nodes being directly hit, what does that do to yourself, what you're feeling and what you're thinking, but also your unit and the wider army that you have in that area?
Well, it's rather bizarre. I expect some of the Russian soldiers are probably delighted because of the cruelty and brutality that's handed out by their commanders. But I think also from a morale side, if somebody is taking out your key areas way behind you, with such precision, then you're starting to realise, and I expect all the rubbish that these troops are fed from their commanders, that they're invincible and the Ukrainians are just some sort of second-rate military. Well, you start to realise that is not the case, and morale is everything in warfare. It's that to get out. Fighting is a terrible game. It's terrifying. But in order to do it effectively, you need to want to do it. You need that morale. So I think, again, adding to other things, yeah, it could be very significant. And yeah, it could break whatever fragile morale those troops have. Because they know that, if the generals can be taken out so easily, what hope have they got? So yeah, I think it's a big issue.
Hello, it's James here. We'll be right back with today's episode of Frontline in just a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about a really exciting new YouTube channel. And if you like Frontline, I think you're going to love this. It's called History Undone with me, James Hansen. And every week we look at a different battle and ask, what if? In other words, asking what the long-term historical consequences might have been had certain key factors panned out differently. Our first episode was all about D-Day. Our latest episode is about the Battle of Arras in 1940. A lesser-known battle, but with huge strategic implications. Had it panned out differently, potentially the British evacuation of Dunkirk may not have happened. Would Churchill have sued for peace? Would the Americans have entered the war? What would have happened to the Soviet Union? Would Stalin have ended up in a prison camp in Berlin? These are the questions we ask every week on History Undone. We'll put a link to the channel in the description of this video. Please do like, share and subscribe and watch History Undone.
Area around Kharkiv, where, as you'll be aware, the Russians have begun this sort of move to put pressure on the city, and they've crossed the border and taken territory. But it does look like the Ukrainians have at least temporarily been able to stabilise that, and that's where they are benefiting from some of the changes in permissions to use international supplied weapons and equipment and far into Russia. Although there is some ambiguity over exactly how far those constraints have been released. So at the moment, a lot of the talk has been around the use of the HIMARS systems, which is a guided multiple launch rocket system. And they've been provided by some of those by the US, a couple of other countries, and they have some UK variants. And they're able to use those now to strike Russian forces on the other side of the border and for what is known as counter-battery fire, so attacking enemy artillery. However, there is some question as to whether or not they're able to use the longer-range attackers, so tactical ballistic missiles. And the reason why that matters is because that's got a range of up to 300 kilometers, and with those, they'd be able to threaten some of the air bases that are further back in Russia, from which both helicopters and Russian jets launching bombs, both against Kharkiv and against Ukrainian frontline forces. That's where they fight from.
Do you think, Matthew, we're already starting to see the impact of that decision a couple of weeks ago by the Americans? I mean, it's interesting that Ukraine has already used HIMARS missiles now on Belgorod last week. There are reports that Russia's moving some of its air defense systems from Crimea to Belgorod Oblast. Is that a direct consequence, do you think, of the decision by the Americans?
I mean, it can be quite difficult to tell, but certainly they are talking as if that counter-battery effort is at least providing them some relief from particularly the shorter-ranged Russian artillery. It does look like they still have issues with Russian aircraft, and as I said, if ATACMS or the longer-range systems aren't available to them, that will still pose a challenge. Now, they have also got a long-range drone program, and they've been using that to strike a variety of targets. And actually, what's interesting is that isn't just confined to the north. So going back 18 months now, they've been trying to use those to disrupt Russian long-range bomber aircraft that fly from a variety of bases across Russia. But what we've seen in the past week are a couple of attacks which are more to the east of Ukraine, reaching across to some of the Russian regions around there. There was a high-profile attack which appears to have at least damaged some of Russia's newer Su-57 aircraft. But they also attacked air bases in North Ossetia. And so it's interesting to see the Ukrainians have still retained the ability to launch those sort of deeper strikes in a number of different directions.
I mean, let's say it is true, and it is only a report at this stage, that the Russians have been moving air defense systems from Crimea to Belgorod, which would make sense. What could the long-term implications of that be? Because, Ukraine has been very consistent over recent months in targeting sites in Crimea. Even in the last few days, there's been again strikes on Russian air defense assets in Crimea. So if you're moving air defense assets out of Crimea, surely that just increases the risk of Crimea becoming weakened from a Russian perspective.
So Crimea is obviously hugely important to both sides. I mean, partly symbolic importance, but also because of what it is as essentially the extension of the front line, and a base from which the Russians have been able to launch attacks up until now from both aircraft and again helicopters, and also as a base for the Black Sea Fleet. Now we've already seen the significant impact on Sevastopol, has forced the Black Sea Fleet to basically move out of the area and largely back to Novorossiysk, and they're being attacked there as well. But by increasing the pressure on Crimea, the Ukrainians are effectively softening it up for what one of the areas where they might want to be looking at for future offensives. I think there's pros and cons, not to that approach, but to the military challenges that are around Crimea. I mean, for starters, the Ukrainians have got the benefit that they have been consistently targeting Crimea for over a year now, with a mixture of their own drones, because it's large chunks of it are out of the range of artillery, and that includes HIMARS. We've seen ATACMS used there, and very prominently, we've seen cruise missiles provided by the West, so things like Storm Shadow, used there. And so they've got the benefit of, from what we can tell, having done some fairly significant damage to Russian air defenses, which increases the chances of future attacks getting through and ratchet up the tension on Russian forces in Crimea. ATACMS also would allow them to potentially attack the Kerch Bridge and other links into Crimea. But the challenges to this approach is that there is still, if you like, the land bridge, the bit of Crimea that the Russians captured in the initial advances, that links it as well. So even cutting the Kerch Bridge, which would put severe pressure on Crimea, doesn't eliminate the ability of the Russians to supply Crimea through other means. They've also got ferries. Those have been attacked recently, so we can see this cumulative pressure building. I think one of the problems will be is that it seems unlikely that this kind of deep strike, long-range attacks on their own will cause the Russians to abandon Crimea. So one of the big issues will be, is there the prospect at some point of Ukrainian forces along that front line being able to up the pressure there as well? Will they be able to maneuver through Russian defenses and seriously threaten Crimea? Because at that point, then the loss of resupply lines, pressure on their headquarters, difficulty refueling their forces, then begins to come to the fore.
That's really interesting. I mean, how feasible do you think that might be, Matthew?
Well, I think the way that we're looking across the whole of the front this year is that it doesn't seem likely that a major Ukrainian, if you like, repeat of the counteroffensive is on the cards. They've still got a lot of work to do to shore up their physical defenses, to recruit personnel, and to bring newly trained personnel together with a still, what's required a fairly significant influx of material support from international partners, so that the recent supplemental from the US is only the start. We're seeing more pledges from other international partners. But in truth, what they probably really want to do is rebuild that force for next year, along with a fairly significant recruitment drive. And they are still somewhat on the defensive in other parts of the country. So if we're looking at the bigger picture, it does look like, whilst the Russians are being pressured now in a number of directions by the Ukrainians, as you say, might be having to move air defenses around, on the ground, the pressure along that eastern front and out of the Donbass and on from Avdiivka is still there. And so that looks like that is still focused on Chasiv Yar, because of how that would, if captured, potentially unlock further inroads. And so there was a lot of speculation, and I think good analysis, that the Kharkiv advance wasn't really intended to capture the city. It was intended to pressure the Ukrainians, so they in turn had to move some of their forces around to shore up their lines.
And there's been so much talk about Ukraine's air defence capacity over recent weeks and months and the need for Patriots, etc. What about Russia's? I mean, the fact they are having to reportedly move air defence systems from Crimea to Belgorod suggests they've also got issues.
Yes, I mean, they've got their air defences in and around sort of Russia proper, as opposed to what they've lost in Crimea, are probably still pretty significant, and they can obviously move essentially weapons around on all of their interior lines. But one of the striking things has been that although the success rate that the Ukrainians appear to have had with some of their drone strikes has been very variable, they are still getting through to some degree. So they've had periodic attacks against Moscow, very long-range target, and not done serious damage, but that's obviously of concern to the Russians. The more recent attack on the Su-57s, which in theory should have been a well-defended target, will have caused some consternation for the Russians. I mean, it hasn't played a huge role in the conflict so far, but as a prestige target, it doesn't look great when it's basically taken out on the runway. There's a question there about the extent to which the Russians have got physical defenses in place. Many of the Ukrainian drones that we're aware of don't have large warheads or penetrating warheads when compared to something like Storm Shadow. And some of these attacks could have been prevented by basic physical defenses like aircraft shelters. And yet they keep having aircraft and helicopters caught out in the open. So there appear to be some challenges for them in terms of defending that very, very long, if you like, frontier with Ukraine, and the Ukrainians' ability to get what in some cases are quite low-profile drones through. That they, from what we've seen of what's been recovered, they're using a combination of some relatively slow but sort of propeller-driven aircraft that are quite low-profile, and some shorter range but jet-powered drones, some of which, if you like converted target drones, basically.
Putin is, I think it's fair to say, not good in a crisis. And the interesting thing is what happened is, as we've seen in similar situations in the past, at first Putin just disappeared from view. You would think, as soon as it's clear that a mercenary army has turned upon you, has just occupied this city, Rostov-on-Don, which includes the headquarters for your operations in Ukraine, and there's an element of it beginning to move towards Moscow, you'd think he'd be right. Putin would be immediately out there calling it out. He didn't really until basically the next morning. And then he did. He called it sort of treachery and the like. And I think this is the key thing. This is always about an attempt to try and win Putin over, more or less make Putin realize that he needed to take Prigozhin and his concerns more seriously. The point at which Putin eventually actually came out and publicly called this treachery, that's a point when Prigozhin knew that the game was up. Now, he wasn't going to be able to take Moscow with the 2,000 or so troops he'd sent as a sort of flying column up there. It was all about theatre and performance. And at that point, Prigozhin started trying to open negotiations. And the interesting thing, again, what we saw is Putin just desperately wanted this problem to go away. It was humiliating for him. I mean, he's always meant to be the guy who's able to manage the elite, and he clearly have failed in this crisis. When people had been telling him for months that the Prigozhin-Shoigu rivalry was going to get dangerous, he had his own security apparatus, not joining the mutiny, but not, frankly, showing any particular enthusiasm for stopping it. I mean, the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov, real Putin loyalist, spent basically all of that crucial day on the phones, trying to get in touch with local commanders and get them to try and stop Wagner. And they made a damn sort of strong campaign of not being contactable by phone, so that they could avoid getting orders that they'd have to either refuse or follow. So in that crisis, actually, Prigozhin got probably a much better deal than he probably would have been expecting, in that, he seems to get away with it.
And at that particular moment, it wasn't inevitable that Prigozhin would be punished in a fatal way for this. Can you tell us about the reprieve that was offered by Putin less than a week after the uprising? What happened exactly?
Well, the deal that was struck, and it was sort of struck by basically Putin's kind of most senior political operatives, with the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, kind of providing a sort of, heavyweight support, was essentially that he has to give up Wagner in Russia and Ukraine. But he can keep the side of Wagner, which is still operating and making a lot of money across Africa and elsewhere. And he can go and set up his base in Belarus, and he might lose some of his business holdings at home, but essentially he'd be able to keep the Concord Group, which is his kind of overarching holding company. So, from his point of view, he's launched a mutiny. His guys have shot down Russian planes and helicopters. He's humiliated Putin. And yet, he's basically, not only is he getting away with it, he's invited for tea at the Kremlin with a whole bunch of his senior commanders. And when Putin more or less suggests, well, how about we put your main chief of staff, man with a sort of call sign of Седой, grey hair, in charge, Prigozhin says, no, the boys won't agree with that. So, actually, Prigozhin is by that point beginning to bounce back and thinking, oh, actually, I'm, maybe a more powerful and a stronger position than I thought. And again, this is a humiliation for Putin. He made too easy, he was too slow at responding. When he did, he wanted this to go away so desperately that he made too generous a deal with Prigozhin. And so Prigozhin's frankly feeling his oats by that point.
Is that what went wrong then? Is that why it didn't work? Was it just that Prigozhin by this point had got too cocky and had pushed it just a little bit too far?
I think it's a combination of things. Yes, that's absolutely the case. We saw this with a big Africa summit that was held in St. Petersburg, where Prigozhin was very pointedly not invited, but he still turns up in St. Petersburg, kind of holding all kind of meetings on the margins. Again, it's almost like he doesn't know that he's not welcome, or he's trying to push things. But also, I think that, when the immediate crisis goes, this is what tends to happen. Putin panics in a crisis and tends to overreact one way or the other, and then over time realizes what he's done. And there were certainly a lot of people around him who had no time for Prigozhin, including Nikolai Patrushev, who at the time was Putin's sort of effectively national security advisor, who clearly was telling him, look, this isn't going to work. And so eventually, again, in some ways, Putin overreacts the other way and decides the only way of quite literally clipping Prigozhin's wings is to have his plane brought down.
And how do you think this whole experience has influenced the way that Putin has shaped his military leadership and political entourage since his re-election?
I think the interesting thing is I don't think it's had a huge effect in terms of shaping his political leadership. Yes, it's led to Shoigu's, in due course, rotation away from the defense ministry. In some ways, actually, Prigozhin, I think, delayed that, because Putin had to allow a certain amount of time to pass. Otherwise, it looked like he was giving in, even posthumously, to what Prigozhin wanted. But so, we have seen some changes. But the main thing is actually the degree to which Putin hasn't responded. I mean, there's no way of getting around the fact that from the point of view of the elite, yes, Putin was able to show strength in the sense of he was able to kill Prigozhin, but frankly, that was never in doubt. If there's one thing that Putin's regime can do is kill people, unfortunately. But mainly, it's precisely the very fact that Putin has to flip-flop, and Putin has to do one thing that he's never done in the past, which is actually break a deal with an insider. Look, Putin lies to all and sundry, breaks international law before breakfast, not a problem. But the idea that within the ranks of the loyalists, you have to know that if you make a deal with the boss will keep to that, is really important, because there's no rule of law. It's only really against like a mafia family. This time Putin broke it, and that really was quite shocking within the elite.
And do you think that breaking of the deal with an insider has had an effect on those on whom Putin has counted for loyalty? Do they now feel, well, if he's gone, anyone can go, and actually our loyalty counts for nothing?
Yes, I think obviously no one's going to turn against Putin tomorrow, because Putin has killed the one person who made the sort of the greatest challenge. But it's a different kind of relationship. It's a relationship of the hostage and the hostage taker more than the sort of willing ally. And there are going to be future crises. That's something that's always going to be the case in politics. And the point is, next time Putin has to make a deal with someone, will they actually feel they can make that deal? Will they feel that Putin can actually be trusted? And it might sound silly to talk about trust in the context of this kind of vicious, self-interested, kleptocratic regime. But when it comes down to it, Putin is just one guy with a handful of fellow septuagenarians who share his vision for Russia and the future, and a much larger elite who are just in it for what they can get out of it. They will be making the constant cost-benefit analyses. What's to my advantage, and what are the dangers? Now, before the Prigozhin mutiny, I think there was that sense that even if you didn't like the way things were going, that at least you knew where you are with Putin, and that Putin was, if nothing else, a competent manager of the elite. Now he's been shown that, in fact, his grasp, his control over the elite is much less strong than it was once upon a time. You know, something that you get time and time again talking to Russians is this sense of that he's no longer the old Putin. And in part, it's about age. In part, it's about over 24 years you get out of touch with your country, whatever. But, you know, that sense that he's no longer the guy they need. But also that sense that, you know, you can't actually trust him. Trust really does matter within elites and political systems.
And when you step back and look at Prigozhin's life and how influential he's been on the world stage, be it in the PR disinformation machine, he had the troll farms that notoriously flooded the internet ahead of Trump's election in 2016, or the paramilitaries and his business dealings. How do you assess it?
I think what it's really shown is, in some ways, and largely in the worst ways, Putin's Russia is ahead of its time. Putin's Russia is one in which the old boundaries between public and private, between one kind of business and another, between the job of a spy and the job of an oligarch, these boundaries matter much, much less. And this was Prigozhin's strength, is he constantly crossed boundaries, not just national ones, obviously, but in terms of what he was doing. But 1 minute he's a catering magnate. Next minute he's running troll farms on contract to the state. Then he's running a mercenary army, which some of the time is doing the Kremlin's work directly, other times it's just making money. And in some ways, the reason he was able to be so successful was precisely that actually we live in a world where a lot of the old boundaries and assumptions about, you know, what's the job of the state versus the private sector matter that much less. So, look, Prigozhin was not driving this process. He was just a very quick and eager person taking advantage of it to make himself a lot of money. But nonetheless, I think it tells us something about a future, firstly, in which wars are just as easily fought by trolls as by jet fighters. But secondly, about one in which actually the boundaries of the state and the non-state are much less clearly cut than we might like to think.
And a year on from the Wagner uprising, in an article that you wrote for the Sunday Times, you suggest in the title that Prigozhin could topple Putin from beyond the grave. Why and how could that happen? Is it because he tapped into this sentiment of a desire for greater fairness? What is it exactly?
I think there's several things, and obviously to a large degree, it's worth noting that it's also wishful thinking on my part. But I think it is important that, first of all, you know, if one looks at how Prigozhin is still being discussed in, to a degree, the Russian media, but much more on social media, he's still very, very present in Russian social media. And it is precisely for this sense, even amongst people who despise him as a human being, but nonetheless say, but at least he believed something. At least he stood for something. Now, look, one can question how far he really believed, but nonetheless, that doesn't matter. I think it actually, the myth becomes powerful precisely because it fits something that people want. There is a pervasive sense in Russia that, you know, for all the talk about nationalism and a grand cause and bringing back traditional values and everything else that Putin tries to convey, it's not really working. There is that sense that there is a vacuum at the heart of Russian state and society. And so people want to feel that that can be filled, and not necessarily by what Prigozhin himself stood for. God, that would be awful. But nonetheless, at least they recognize the value of someone who did seem to believe in something. So that's the first reason why this is actually significant. And secondly, again, it is about the corrosion of Putin's control over his elite that is absolutely crucial. Now, you know, it's not corrosion that has actually broken the system yet, but nonetheless, it means that the next crisis that it goes into, it will be that much weaker. That the old fallbacks, which was Putin's personal authority and his control over the security apparatus, which is kind of the final backstop of his rule. Both of those have now been shaken.
In October 2023 is when it became clear to the Russians that the U.S. congressional debate on the supplemental aid would be a long, protracted, ugly affair. And that's when the Russians started cooking up a plan to try to exploit the situation that would inevitably occur when the aid would be delayed. Throughout the course of October up until about, I'd say, early May, we had the Russians conducting offensive operations in Avdiivka. We had the Russians setting conditions and that during that time redeploying significant forces to northeastern Ukraine, the border regions and Kursk and Bryansk and Belgorod Oblast to create this large operational grouping of about 30 to 50,000 soldiers. That is the group that then on May 10th entered northeastern Ukraine with their renewed Kharkiv operation. That wasn't any sort of operation that the Russians decided to execute out of an easy opportunity or sort of a spur of the moment sort of thing. They set conditions and planned for that many, many months in advance. And that was, I think, it started to metastasize back in October. Concretely, since the Russians began their Kharkiv offensive on May 10th, the Russians have made very small tactical gains. You can go measure it on the map, but they've only penetrated, such and thus kilometers, not very far. They've lost a lot of forces, and they've been held up and pinned down in Vovchansk for a while. They've yet to seize the entire city, and Ukrainian forces have been conducting a series of tactical counterattacks to try to improve their tactical positions within the city. The Russians, nonetheless, they still maintain significant operational reserves for this operation. By our estimates, they've only committed about a third, maybe a little bit more of their prepared force for this operation. And the Russians absolutely maintain the opportunity to be able to intensify their operations. I'd note that, over the last 24 hours, the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, just announced as of yesterday, June 9th, that some of his Chechen forces actually crossed the border from Kursk into Sumy Oblast, and they claim that they seized a border village. We need to verify those claims, but I would just add that it would be completely consistent with the Russian campaign design, which is the Russians seek to open up a series of fronts, put military pressure on the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians then stretch themselves too thin across this whole theater of operations in order to generate opportunities and facilitate what could be some Russian breakthroughs in what we think is the priority area, eastern Ukraine.
And those developments that you've just described since the US aid package, have they been smaller tactical gains on Russia's behalf than you might have expected, or greater, or indeed exactly what you would have predicted?
Yeah, so I think the tactical gains around Avdiivka that especially occurred in April were concerning because it seemed like the Russians were able to actually exploit the fact that the Ukrainians there were underprepared, under-equipped, and they managed to project west of Avdiivka at a rate that surprised me, faster than what I would have expected. But recently it's bogged down as the Russians have actually approached the main area where the Ukrainians have built their main line of defense just west of Avdiivka. So it was fast at first, but then it slowed down in a surprising way. With regards to the Kharkiv operation, that was very interesting. We were forecasting the Russians to actually start their Kharkiv operation much later than they actually did. The time window we were thinking that they would begin it would be late May or early June. They began it in early May on May 10, and also under strength. All the indicators suggested that the Russians wanted to create an operational grouping of about 50 to 100,000 forces, personnel for that operation, and they committed to it significantly under strength of that target, somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 50,000, so about half. And I think the timing and the seeming decision for the Russians to go after this offensive, despite not yet being fully prepared to their desired strength, is indicative of the Russians indeed wanted to seize the opportunity before the aid began to surge to the front. I think they expedited the timetables to try to make sure that they could get whatever they could, create whatever effects they're trying to create on the ground before the Ukrainians would be able to rebuff them. And there's a risk there, right? You take advantage of that opportunity when the aid situation and the material situation is worse for the Ukrainians, but you also take a risk in that your own strength isn't there. And that so far, it seems that gamble has not paid off for the Russians.
Interesting. It's also been just over a week since the US changed its stance on Ukraine using donated weapons to strike targets inside of Russia in a limited way. How would you assess at this stage Ukraine's use of that permission? And has the US done enough, do you think, to change the situation on the front?
Yeah. So the best metric that we have for this is the performance of the Russian offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, which as of late May and early June has been pretty poor. And I think part of that is, in fact, that the U.S., the Biden administration, they made the decision to allow the Ukrainians to conduct some limited fires across the border at some Russian forces. It's an extremely important policy change. However, I want to highlight that it's actually a very, very small and very limited change. I think it was mischaracterized by most reports as being this monumental watershed moment for U.S. policy and is a real game changer for the war. And it certainly has the potential to be that. But at this stage, it really isn't. If you study the minutiae of the actual policy change, the Biden administration has allowed the Ukrainians to use a subset of weapons, the HIMARS Gimlers, the guided multiple launch rocket artillery, to strike targets that are actively attacking Ukraine in the vicinity of Kharkiv. The U.S. policy still does not permit the Ukrainians to use their most effective weapons that the U.S. has given Ukraine, ATACMS missiles that can strike into the operational rear and deep rear. I just published a map about this yesterday, but if you look on the map of concretely sort of what changed with the policy, you'll find that the sanctuary space that the Russians use to shield their forces has been decreased by at maximum 16%. That is to say, 84% of all of the shielded territory still remains. And unfortunately, it's not just about numbers. I think, when a commander is conducting operations and they're fielding hundreds of thousands of men and they're pushing a lot of material and fuel and lubricants and projecting into another country for operations, any commander has to make a choice between balancing two desirable things, economic efficiency and expediency versus protection. Crudely speaking, when you have a tank formation, you can drive it in a column. That is the one that that optimizes economic expediency and fuel efficiency, but it's dangerous because if you get caught with your pants down by the adversary, you're lined up and easy to be destroyed. The way that you would actually try to maximize protection would be you flare out, you go into line formation, you're dispersed, you move slower, but if you get engaged, you're prepared to handle that threat. Right now, this huge territory in the Russian Federation bordering Ukraine is optimized for economic efficiency. And my argument is that if the Biden administration follows suit, like many European states have now done, and remove all restrictions on what the Ukrainians are allowed to target in Russia, then it will force upon the Russian command to make difficult decisions about to what extent do they reconfigure their rear and support areas in order to maximize protection, or at least improve protection in exchange for supporting at the expense of efficiency. Concretely, that'll have very important effects for Ukraine. Big ammunition depots will be partitioned and more sliced into a series of dispersed and small ammunition depots. Same for fuel. You won't be able to have big accumulations of your forces as far as deep. You'll have to stretch your interior lines further. And what we've seen is that the Russians perform a lot better when they have short interior lines versus long interior lines. It's also critical for the air operations that the Ukrainians are planning and the air capabilities they're trying to build. Russia has limited air defense and electronic warfare protection assets. And right now, the Russian command enjoys the luxury of being able to exclusively have to worry about protecting the frontmost areas of the theater in Ukraine. And they can really pile on all of their air defense assets in a very relatively geographically small area, as opposed to having to consider the need to deploy those inwards, rearray the way that they have these limited assets deployed to protect important and vulnerable targets in the rear. And if we can actually get the Russians to redeploy some of those air defense assets instead of being at the front to the rear, then that, of course, will make a better operating environment for the various different Western aircraft that are going to be going into Ukraine soon.
You mentioned a moment ago the air operations that Ukraine is planning as part of the defensive operations in the north of Ukraine. Ukraine has launched an airstrike using a Ukrainian Air Force jet for the first time against what's been called a Russian command node in Belgorod. How significant do you think that attack is?
Yeah, we're working on trying to see what kind of battle damage assessment we can clarify from the extent of that attack. But in general, I think it's very important. I think it's extremely important that we revisit collectively our assumptions about air power in this war. For the first 2.5 years of this war, really, air power has been sort of a secondary or tertiary afterthought when it comes to war. And a large part of that is because I think it actually stems from the sanctuary, right? We've assumed that the Ukrainians are not going to be capable of using air power the way NATO would use air power because the Russians have a very capable air force and they have a lot of air defense systems on the ground that we're not able to take out. And if we start to examine some of those assumptions, right, like why can't we take out the air defense systems? Well, it's because they're based on Russian territory. And we can't strike Russian territory. Well, if we check that assumption, it no longer is axiomatically impossible that using Scalp and Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians could conduct a shaping operation that seeks to destroy Russian air defense systems, S-300s and S-400s, try to get the Russians to redeploy some of those from the front towards the rear to protect them. And then it's no longer sort of a crazy thought to say the Ukrainians can start building towards, over the course of many months and years, a concept of operations where you actually do have Ukrainian aircraft operating in the theater, conducting strikes, doing air-to-air operations, and supporting combined arms. I think this Ukrainian strike, if it's confirmed against the bunker node in Belgorod, that's going to be very important, and I hope it'll be the first heralding event for what will be a renewed series of Ukrainian operations in the air domain.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.